Hello, and welcome to ELA Plus. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. In today's video, we're going to learn how to read a poem. Obviously, everyone watching this video already knows how to read and therefore how to read a poem, but I'm not talking about the science of how to read a poem. I'm talking about the art of how to read a poem. I'm talking about how to read a poem intelligently. Now, this video is part of a three-part series here at ELA Plus called How to Read. So, if you're interested in learning how to read intelligently, then these videos are for you. There are 3 rules for how to intelligently read a poem. First, we're going to learn those 3 rules. Then we're going to apply those 3 rules to some poetry together. After that, we're going to ask ourselves why we should be interested in reading poetry in the first place by taking a look at a passage from a William Carlos Williams poem. After that, we're going to do some review questions, some comprehension questions, and as always, I encourage you to answer these questions down in the comments below. Doing so is really going to help you move this material to your long-term memory. And after that, I'm going to leave you with some links so you can explore poetry further in your daily life if you're interested in doing that, which you definitely should be interested in doing. Poetry is awesome. Now, before we get started, I'd like to ask you to please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Doing so is really going to help us build the channel, and I thank you in advance for that. Learning how to read poetry is very simple. There are only 3 rules you need to keep in mind. Just 3 rules to unlock the mystery, beauty, and power of poetry. The first rule is simple. Read the poem. Read the entire poem. Read the entire poem to yourself. Poetry has a unity, a meaning, an essence. And this meaning or essence or unity is not found in just the opening or closing lines or stanzas. It's found in the totality of the poem. So again, read the poem to yourself and try to do it in one sitting. Now, I know that you're not going to be able to read the entire poem of, say, Homer's Epics or Milton's Paradise Lost in one sitting, but generally speaking, the poems that you're going to be reading in class or on your own are so short that you are going to be able to read them in one sitting. So do it. Read the poem. Here are some tips for reading a poem for the first time. Don't turn off all your critical faculties during this initial reading, but do keep those critical faculties in the back pocket as you casually stroll along with this poem. In fact, what you want to do is you want to treat this initial reading of a poem like you would the initial meeting of another person. You don't want to get to know their deep personal stories just yet. Rather, what you want to do is you just want to get the basics. So listen to the poem. By doing this, you're going to get a general understanding of what the poem is about. Its rhythm, its artistry, its meaning. Well, unless of course it's a T.S. Eliot poem, in which case you're just going to nod your head, pretend like you know what he's talking about, and then if asked about it later in class, you're going to say something about alienation or Christianity. But aside from T.S. Eliot, I promise you that if you read the poem to yourself in its entirety, you'll be able to get a general, basic understanding of that poem. And this is a crucial first step in reading a poem intelligently. So, to reiterate, rule number 1, read the poem. So you've read the poem. Now what? Well, the next rule is that you have to read the poem out loud. That's right, you have to read the poem again, only this time out loud. Now, you might be wondering why. Why do I need to read this poem again and out loud? Well, as it turns out, most of early poetry was oral. And that part of poetry has, I think, filtered down to us. Think about it. The various devices that poets use when writing poetry lend it a certain musicality. Rhythm, rhyme, assonance, alliteration, meter. All these things make a poem a little bit like music. Hearing a poem, therefore, as opposed to just reading it, can help us understand it better. So rule number 2 is read the poem out loud. There are a few things that you want to keep in mind when you're reading a poem out loud. The first thing is, you don't want to read too fast. You want to slow it down a little bit. A lot of us tend to speak really quickly, or we get nervous, so we rush through a reading. Take it easy. Take a breath, slow it down, and read it deliberately and at a normal pace. Second, don't be overly dramatic when you're reading a poem. Now, I know that poetry has this grandiloquent, rarefied reputation, but forget all that. Just read the poem in your natural voice. Don't be overly dramatic. I'm going to give you an example of how not to read a poem, and then an example of how to read a poem. And we're going to be looking at Shakespeare's Sonnet number 18. Now, as it turns out, we are going to read the entirety of Shakespeare's sonnets and analyze Shakespeare's sonnets at ELA+. Those videos are forthcoming, so we're going to get even deeper into this famous poem. But for now, let me just say, this is how not to read Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Nah, don't do that. Read it in a normal voice, like this. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Nailed it. So yeah, just read it in your normal voice. Don't be overly dramatic. Also, remember to read according to a poem's punctuation, not according to its line breaks. Poets will often break stanzas down in the middle of a line, but just because a line ends does not mean that the reading should end. If you do read according to the lines, very often a poem will read very choppy. It's not artful at all. It doesn't sound good, and you won't like it. But if you read it according to its punctuation, then it will sound good. It will sound artful. As an example, let's take a look at this poem by the American poet Sara Teasdale. This is how you do not want to read this poem. Fields beneath a quilt of snow, from which the rocks and stubble peep, and in the west a shy white star that shivers as it wakes from sleep. The restless rumble of the train, the drowsy people in the car, steel blue twilight in the world, and in my heart a timid star. Now contrast that choppy reading with this reading according to the punctuation rather than according to the line breaks. Fields beneath a quilt of snow from which the rocks and stubble peep, and in the west a shy white star that shivers as it wakes from sleep. The restless rumble of the train, the drowsy people in the car, steel blue twilight in the world, and in my heart a timid star. Did you hear the difference? Reading a poem properly establishes its rhythm, its meter. Reading it improperly completely butchers it. This is why when you read a poem out loud, you want to read according to its punctuation, not its line breaks. The last thing you want to do when reading a poem aloud is have a dictionary at hand. And what can I say? A dictionary is going to help you understand what a word means and also how to pronounce it, and those two things are very important when reading anything, but particularly poetry. The third rule for reading poetry is we don't want to read too much into the poet's biography. There's been a movement afoot, I'd say, in recent times that we want to take the writer's biography, their history, their identity, their politics as the central aspect of their work. This is, in my view, a mistake. While biographical details can be important in informing our understanding of a poet's work, they're far from the central concern. The central concern is the poem itself. When we focus too much on a poet or really any writer's biography, we shade our reading with our own biases and prejudices concerning that biographical profile. We don't want to do that. What we want to do is focus primarily on the poem itself. Again, biographical detail isn't unimportant. It's just not as important as the text itself. So focus on the text of the poem, not the biography. So now we know the basic 3 rules for reading poetry. But why should we be interested in reading poetry to begin with? I mean, poetry is difficult, poetry is boring, and poems are really hard to understand. Nobody really reads them anymore anyway. All of these excuses not to read poetry are completely wrong. Poems are not boring. Go ahead and ask your teacher if you could read for your class Cut a List 16. I'm certain that your teacher is going to be very impressed with your knowledge of and passion for Latin poetry. And also, poems are not difficult to understand. All you have to do is apply the 3 rules that we reviewed here. Probably the most important reason why you want to read poetry, though, is because you're being asked to in your English language arts class. And as it happens, ELA Plus is going to provide a reading and analysis of most of the poems that you're likely to encounter during your English language arts career. So we got you covered, don't worry about it. Aside from school, though, there are many other reasons why you'd want to read poetry. Probably the most important is that it helps us to understand ourselves and others and the world much better. A passage from a William Carlos Williams poem is apropos here. This poem is called Asphodel, That Greeny Flower, and this is kind of a long poem, so we're not going to read the whole thing, even though that violates one of our rules. But we're just going to focus on this particular passage because I believe it really gets to the heart of what poetry is and why it's important that you should make it a part of your daily life, even outside of the classroom. So let's see what William Carlos Williams has to say. It is difficult to get the news from poems, but men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. So what do you think? Do you agree with Williams? Let me know down in the comments. So we've reached the end of our lesson, and now we know how to intelligently read a poem. First, we reviewed the 3 rules for reading poetry, and we applied those 3 rules to some poems. After that, we also asked ourselves the question of why we want to read poetry, and in order to answer that question, we read a William Carlos Williams poem. And now it's time to do some review questions, and again, I encourage you to answer these questions down in the comments below. By answering them, by physically writing them out, this is going to help move that material from your short-term memory into your long-term memory. So let's take a look at those questions. 1. What are the 3 rules of reading poetry? 2. Use these 3 rules to read the entirety of the William Carlos Williams poem, Asphodel, That Greeny Flower. What is the poem about? And number 3, what poem are you going to read next? Now here are some places that you can go to further explore poetry. The first is the Poetry Foundation. This is one of my favorites. It's an excellent webpage, and I really do suggest that you go there and visit. Here you're going to find access to a limitless amount of poems and from all eras. You're also going to get access to interviews with poets, essays about poetry, and lessons in poetry, if you need any after this video lesson. Also maybe take a look at the Library of Congress's poetry portal. The Library of Congress is amazing, and there's good stuff here. Now, I think the Library of Congress is one of the largest libraries in the world, so there's going to be plenty of material there. I think you'll find something that you like. There's also your local library. I'm sure a librarian will be very helpful and very eager to point you in the right direction of their poetry collection. Finally, poets.org is a very nice webpage. It's similar to the Poetry Foundation, but one of the things that they offer here is the 1 poem a day email newsletter. I subscribe, and it's a great way to stay in touch with poetry, to make poetry a part of your daily life. I think you'll like it. This concludes our lesson on how to read a poem. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from it. If you did, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. Also consider sharing it with friends, fellow students, and your English teacher. If you have any questions about this video or other questions about your English language arts studies in school, please do not hesitate to ask down in the comments. I'm available, and I'll do my very best to offer high-quality answers to anything you might want to know. In the show notes, you'll find links to the internet sources I cited if you want to explore more. I encourage you to do so. ELA Plus is a free, regularly updated supplemental guide to the English language arts. Subscribe to learn more. Until our next lesson, keep reading, get obsessed, and take care of yourselves and others. Thank you.